Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Before we take up today's The Hindu analysis, let us take a look at the press release that was released yesterday by the UPSC. Most of you had concerns with the schedule of this year's prelims examination in the backdrop of the coronavirus pandemic. These concerns were natural because the UPSC has already postponed the ongoing interviews for the 2019 batch and as well as a few other examinations. But with regard to civil services prelims for 2020, UPSC has said that the schedule remains unchanged as of now and the examination is all set to be held on the 31st of May 2020. But of course, depending on the evolving situation, if necessary, UPSC might postpone the examination and the same would be notified on its website. So for the time being, instead of indulging in speculation, assume that the examination would be held as per the scheduled date and continue with your preparation. And the press release also notes that the chairman and members of UPSC have decided to voluntarily forego 30% of the basic pay of their salary for the next 1 year in order to conserve financial resources at the national level and aid the national economy in its fight against the coronavirus pandemic. This is important to us because Article 318 of the Indian Constitution states that the conditions of service of the chairman and members of the UPSC cannot be varied to their disadvantage by the appointing authority after their appointment. So the appointing authority cannot cut their salaries, and hence the chairman and the members have decided to voluntarily forego 30% of the basic pay for the next 1 year. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper, beginning with an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. In line with the Prime Minister's announcement, the Government of India has notified a few guidelines and classifications in order to implement and enforce the second phase of the lockdown. According to this strategy, the Government of India has classified the country into 3 different zones at a district level based on the occurrence of COVID-19 cases. According to this color-coded classification, the Government of India has classified a total of 736 districts into the red zone, white zone and the green zone. Under the red zone, 170 districts where major outbreaks and large clusters have been reported have been identified as hotspots, and as informed by the Prime Minister, the central government, the state governments and the district administration will prioritize these hotspots under the red zone, and the lockdown would be enforced very strictly in these hotspots. According to data made available by the government, Tamil Nadu has the most number of these hotspots, followed by Maharashtra. And 33% of these hotspots are located in the 5 southern states. Then 207 districts have been identified as potential hotspots and they have been placed under the white zone. These are the districts where cases have been reported but no major outbreak or cluster formation has been noticed. So the government authorities will closely monitor and carry out surveillance in these potential hotspots and strictly enforce the lockdown with minimal restrictions in order to prevent the potential hotspot from turning into a hotspot. Then the remaining 359 districts where no cases have been reported, they have been classified under the green zone. These are the districts where the lockdown might be partially lifted with few specific relaxations after the 20th of April. But of course, this is a dynamic classification and it shall be periodically updated depending upon the spread and the containment of the outbreak. Next, in another article on page number 1, the revised lockdown guidelines that has been notified by the Ministry of Home Affairs has been covered. As per these revised guidelines, the wearing of masks in public places has been made compulsory. Then spitting in public places has been made a punishable offence. Unfortunately, it took us a pandemic to do this. Then the sale of alcohol, tobacco, gutka has been prohibited. And the current closure of malls, all places of worship, etc. shall continue till the end of the lockdown period. Apart from this, the existing ban on public transport, movement of taxis, autos, cab aggregators, etc. will continue. The suspension of passenger trains, domestic air travel and international air travel shall also continue until the 3rd of May. But the revised guidelines also provides for a few exemptions. Industries that are located outside cities will be allowed to function, but these workplaces which have been classified as essential services, they will have to implement the standard protocols prescribed by the guidelines. Similarly, those who have been exempted to travel for work would also have to follow these standard protocols. Then the revised guidelines provides for the complete resumption of all agricultural and horticultural activities. It allows Manrega works to be carried out, but with the strict implementation of social distancing and the usage of masks. Other essential services such as post offices, banks, ATMs, animal husbandry, etc. have also been provided with exemptions under the revised guidelines. Then in the IT sector, companies have been allowed to function with up to a maximum strength of 50% of their employees. Similar exemptions have been provided to special economic zones, construction sector, fertilizer units, pharmaceutical companies, oil refining units, etc. These revised guidelines have been notified by the Ministry of Home Affairs under the provisions of the Disaster Management Act of 2005, and state governments cannot dilute these guidelines and provisions at any cost. But the central government has provided a great deal of flexibility to state governments in order to provide for stricter restrictions. And the centre has asked the state governments to book those who violate these guidelines under Section 188 of the Indian Penal Code and as well as under the Disaster Management Act. Section 188 of the IPC deals with those who disobey the orders of a public servant and provides for a strict punishment. Next, on page number 6, we have an editorial which evaluates these guidelines. The editorial calls it an attempt of the government to partially reopen the economy that had come to a standstill. And the success of this strategy is entirely dependent on our ability to contain the spread of the pandemic. Because only if the number of hotspots are brought down, only then a further reopening of the economy can be considered. So as we discussed yesterday, one thing is very clear. This is going to be a long drawn out battle and the pandemic is not going to come to an end anytime soon. As we discussed, unless a vaccine is found or a cure is found or unless we attain herd immunity, this pandemic is here to stay and this could take at least 3 to 4 years. So in this state, restoring normalcy is going to take time and we need to accept this as the new normal. But at the same time, an indefinite closure or a lockdown is also not possible because any further damage to the economy is going to cost us more lives than the pandemic itself. So in this regard, the editorial praises the Government of India for attempting to partially reopen the economy with these revised set of guidelines. So going forward, this might be the norm for the next few years because the government has been forced to strike a balance between saving lives and sustaining livelihoods. But the downside of these restrictions and lockdowns is that it is going to have a disproportionate impact on the weaker sections. Daily wage earners, laborers, women, minorities, etc. are going to be hit particularly hard over the coming few years because these restrictions are going to affect their livelihood and further push them towards hunger, poverty and malnutrition. Then upon this, the usage of coercive measures by the enforcement agencies for enforcing these restrictions is going to further have a disproportionate impact on the weaker sections. So the combination of coercion from the state and forced deprivation of the weaker sections could easily increase social tensions in the coming days. That's the reason why the editorial is calling for a more comprehensive strategy from the government to sustain a partial economy. The editorial is asking the government to provide an incentive to employers in order to encourage non-essential employees to work from home. If non-essential employees are allowed to work from home for the coming few years, it will reduce the burden on the essential sectors and make it easier to maintain social distancing or physical distancing. Then the editorial is reminding the government that it has to treat the weaker sections with utmost empathy and it has to immediately expand the welfare measures in order to supplement their income, in order to provide for adequate food and nutrition, in order to take care of their health and educational needs. And upon this, the government will have to carry out mass education and awareness programs in order to promote the usage of masks, maintenance of hygiene, maintenance of physical distancing, and all of this calls for changes in social behavior. The best way to achieve this would be for the government to rely upon community engagement. This model of community engagement has worked successfully in states such as Kerala and Rajasthan. So this is a model that the central government can learn from. So if the government has to avoid social tension in the coming years due to a partially running economy, then it has to effectively manage the stress on the economy and as well as the stress on the weaker sections. Next, in a shocking development, US President Donald Trump has decided to freeze funding to the World Health Organization, and he has accused the international organization of mismanaging the COVID-19 crisis. The war of words between the WHO and the US President was going on over the last few days, and the US President had threatened to cut the funding, alleging that the WHO had failed to stem the crisis in the initial stages itself. See, over the last 4 months, even we have discussed that the WHO has often failed to act proactively against infectious diseases. We have seen this happening with regard to H1N1, SARS, Ebola, and we have seen the same happening with regard to COVID-19 as well. There are definitely certain deficiencies on the part of WHO, but the allegation of Mr. Trump that WHO chose to be politically correct over saving lives is uncalled for during this time of crisis when international cooperation is of utmost importance. The accusation of the United States is that in the initial stages of the pandemic, the WHO chose to be politically correct in order to avoid causing embarrassment to China where the outbreak had begun. So this makes the US believe that the failure of the WHO in accurately assessing the initial stages of the outbreak turned it into a pandemic which has killed more than 125,000 people. This makes the United States believe that the WHO failed to issue timely alerts to other countries and it failed to take timely action which could have contained the outbreak to China itself. Many countries, including India, believe that the deficiencies of the WHO did enable the spread of the pandemic. But to accuse the WHO of colluding with China and cutting funding to this crucial international organization on this pretext, in order to cover up the failures of the US government, is completely uncalled for during this time of crisis. That's the reason why Donald Trump's decision has been heavily criticized by global leaders for weakening the capacities of the WHO and for undermining international cooperation at a crucial juncture. But however, this is not the first time that Mr. Trump has undermined international cooperation. He has a long history of pulling United States out of crucial organizations, including the UNESCO, UN Human Rights Council, the Paris Agreement of the Climate Change Convention, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, etc. That's the reason why Trump is being criticized by global leaders for weakening the capacities of WHO and undermining international cooperation during a crisis. This hasty decision of Donald Trump has been met with severe backlash and criticism from the leaders of the United Nations, European Union, African Union, and as well as from countries such as China, European countries, etc. Interestingly, India's response to this decision of Donald Trump has been more muted and neutral. This is quite shocking because India, which has always been a champion of international cooperation, has always been critical of any attempt to weaken multilateral institutions. But considering that the battle between the United States and the WHO is more political in nature, India has probably decided to stay out of it, and it has said that the country is preoccupied with domestic efforts at containing the pandemic. See, it is true that the WHO has a number of deficiencies, and they need to be addressed through a series of reforms. But to undermine a crucial international organization while the world is dealing with an unprecedented crisis is simply irresponsible behavior on the part of the United States. Because we do not have an alternative to the World Health Organization, and as observed by Bill Gates, there is no other organization that can replace the WHO as of now. If you look at its funding pattern, it receives funds through a mix of assessed and voluntary contributions that are made by the member states. The member states of the WHO contribute to its functioning, which is relative to the wealth and population of the member state. So accordingly, countries such as India have committed around $2 million to the WHO, whereas China has committed around $28.7 million. But the biggest contributors to the WHO are the European economies and the United States. Hence, the decision of Donald Trump to cut American funding to WHO is going to severely affect the capacities of WHO at a time when the world is dealing with an unprecedented crisis. The same opinion is shared by this editorial on page number 6 as well. The editorial acknowledges that the WHO does have some deficiencies in its functioning and capabilities, but to accuse the WHO of colluding with China is simply irresponsible on the part of the United States. Because see, the WHO has no independent powers to investigate an outbreak in a particular country. It only relies upon information that is shared by the individual member states. So if China had underreported the extent of the outbreak, WHO cannot be held directly responsible for this. And the editorial points out that the WHO has been proactive in issuing timely alerts, travel advisories, testing and containment strategies, etc. So the editorial concludes by saying that the blame game that the United States has engaged in with WHO and China is simply an attempt of President Trump to cover up his own failure and irresponsible statements, which has single-handedly contributed to more than 6 lakh cases and more than 30,000 deaths in the United States. Now let's take up another article from page number 1, which provides a number of important points for prelims. The Indian Meteorological Department has predicted a normal monsoon for India this year. See, the IMD is an agency under the Ministry of Earth Sciences, and it has been designated as the early warning and forecasting agency for all meteorological and weather phenomena such as monsoons, cyclones, cloudbursts, droughts, etc. The IMD is also the designated nodal agency for monitoring and measuring earthquakes. It monitors the seismological activity through a series of sensors that have been set up across the country by the National Center for Seismology. As a part of its responsibility for forecasting monsoons, the IMD comes out with a monsoon forecast in 2 stages. It comes out with a forecast once in April and once in May, right before the arrival of monsoons. So as a part of this first stage of forecast, the IMD has predicted that India would be receiving normal monsoons this year. This forecast has been developed by the IMD by using complex weather modeling and statistical models that are run through mathematical simulations on supercomputers. According to this forecast, there would be negligible impact of El Nino on this year's monsoon. See, El Nino refers to a unique phenomena in the Pacific Ocean. It refers to the abnormal heating up of the central equatorial Pacific that is located between the coast of Peru and the Australian coast. And the higher than normal temperature in this region of the Pacific can have a significant impact on monsoons in India, and it is also responsible for causing droughts in India. I have explained the El Nino phenomena in detail on the 26th of Feb 2019, so kindly go back and watch this analysis. Then the IMD's forecast also refers to another type of weather-related phenomena known as the Indian Ocean Dipole. See, the Indian Ocean Dipole, or also known as IOD, is a temperature anomaly that is recorded in the Indian Ocean region that can have a significant impact on the monsoons in India. According to IMD's forecast, this year's Indian Ocean Dipole is expected to be neutral, and a combination of these factors is expected to bring normal monsoons to India. Now let us take a quick look at the entry and withdrawal of monsoons in India, which can be important for prelims. See, the first place in India where monsoon arrives is the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands record the arrival of monsoons somewhere in the last week of May. But if you look at only the Indian mainland, the first place where the monsoon makes an onset is the state of Kerala, and it usually arrives on the 1st of June, and if delayed, the arrival will take place in the first week of June. Then slowly, the southwest monsoon progresses to cover the northeast of India, the southern and the western parts of India, and by the end of June or mid-July, the whole of country would be covered by the southwest monsoon winds. Over the next couple of months, it brings rainfall across India, and finally, the monsoon winds start retreating by mid-October. The arrival and the withdrawal of the monsoon is very, very important for the Indian economy because Indian agriculture is directly dependent on it. Any abnormal delay in arrival can significantly affect the cropping season. Next, on page number 14, we have a very interesting article in which the writer analyzes how pandemics in the past have shaped human society and history and have led to the collapse of empires, weakened preeminent institutions, caused social upheavals, and brought down wars. First, the writer talks about the Justinian Plague, which was recorded in 6th century Egypt. This plague, which initially broke out in Egypt, quickly spread to Constantinople, which was the then capital of the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople is nothing but modern-day Istanbul in Turkey, and since it is located at the crossroads of Europe, Africa and Asia, the pandemic spread very quickly through the movement of traders and soldiers across the region. When this pandemic broke out, the Byzantine Empire was at its peak under the leadership of Justinian. But the quick spread of the pandemic ended up killing 25 to 100 million people, and it substantially weakened the Byzantine Empire and its supply lines. By the time this pandemic came to an end in 750 AD, the Byzantine Empire had collapsed and it had lost most of its territories located across Europe, Africa, Middle East, etc. The next major pandemic is the Black Death or pestilence, which hit Europe and Asia in 14th century. This has to be the deadliest pandemic in the history of mankind because its estimated death count is around 75 to 200 million people. When the plague arrived in Europe in 1347, nearly 50% of European population was wiped out due to the pandemic. Historian Walter Scheidel refers to the Black Death as one of the 4 greatest levelers in the history of mankind, which has flattened inequality. Because by the end of the pandemic, the gap between the upper class and the lower classes had reduced significantly, and the pandemic had directly contributed to an increase in wages for agricultural laborers. It made more land available to farmers. It also weakened the preeminent status of the landowners and nearly tripled the wages of laborers. Another major impact of Black Death was on the relationship between the church and the state. The Catholic Church, which was very dominant in Europe until then, was substantially weakened as more people lost faith in the church due to the pandemic. Then came the Spanish flu, which hit Europe nearly a century ago. This flu broke out during the last phase of the First World War, and it ended up killing nearly 50 million people. Even though the flu affected both the Allied powers and the Axis powers, it has been said that the flu had a disproportionate impact on the Axis powers led by Germany and Austria. It has been well documented that the flu was one of the reasons behind the defeat of Germany because it had significantly weakened Germany's war efforts. Now we have the COVID-19 pandemic that is affecting almost every country in the world, and we need to wait and watch whether the radical changes that it is going to bring in would be for the good or for the bad. Now let's take up the practice questions. Which chemical compound was used in disinfection tunnels that were set up in crowded places across the country during the COVID-19 pandemic? The correct answer is option A. It was sodium hypochlorite. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 11, disinfectant tunnels that are being set up around the country can actually be harmful to human beings. See, as the COVID-19 pandemic spread, a number of district administrations have taken the initiative to set up these disinfectant tunnels at crowded places. These tunnels are basically spraying sodium hypochlorite, which can potentially have a harmful impact on human beings. See, generally, chlorine-based compounds are used as a bleaching agent or as a disinfectant. 0.5% of sodium hypochlorite, which is known as darkened solution, is used as a bleaching agent and disinfectant in order to clean areas that have been contaminated with bodily fluids such as blood. But in higher concentration, sodium hypochlorite can be actually dangerous to human beings. When humans are exposed to 5% sodium hypochlorite, it can cause severe irritation of the nasal canal, it can cause sore throat, coughing, etc. In even higher concentration of 10 to 15%, sodium hypochlorite can cause severe damage to multiple organs and can lead to swelling, formation of blisters. It can affect the respiratory tract. It can cause damage to the eye and the skin. It can even lead to diarrhea and vomiting. Even the WHO has made it clear that disinfectants such as sodium hypochlorite will work only on surfaces and not on the human body. In fact, such strong disinfectants can cause more harm to human beings. Now let's take up the next practice question. The chairperson and members of the National Human Rights Commission are appointed by the President of India. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because this article on page number 11 makes a reference to the NHRC. The NHRC has asked the central government to issue an advisory to the state governments and union territories to ensure that the basic rights of citizens are protected even during the lockdown period. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? Civil defense functions under the Ministry of Defense. Civil defense in India was revamped after the 1962 war with China and the 1965 war with Pakistan and given statutory status by passing the Civil Defense Act in 1968. The Act was suitably amended in 2009 to include disaster management as an additional role for the Civil Defense Corps. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect because civil defense functions under the Ministry of Home Affairs and not the Ministry of Defense. So the correct answer is option D, 2 and 3 only. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 11, civil defense volunteers are assisting the local administration, that is the district administration under the DM, and they are playing a key role in the implementation of the containment strategy. Civil defense volunteers across the country are assisting the district administration in screening suspected cases, in monitoring and carrying out surveillance where outbreaks have been reported, in promoting awareness amongst the people, and they are also arranging food, basic supplies and essentials to the elderly people and as well as to the weaker sections. See, prior to the 1962 conflict with China, India's civil defense policy was not very well evolved. But after having fought two wars in 1962 and 1965, India passed the Civil Defense Act in 1968 in order to streamline the service offered by civil defense volunteers. Initially, their role was only to assist the civilian administration during times of wars and conflicts. But over a period of time, their mandate has been updated to include calamities and disasters as well. This change in mandate was made official when the Civil Defense Act was amended in 2009 and disaster management was also included as one of their responsibilities. Now let's take up another practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The International Energy Agency is a Paris-based autonomous intergovernmental organization established under the framework of OECD. It was set up in the wake of the 2008-2009 financial crisis and was initially dedicated to responding to physical disruptions in the supply of oil, as well as serving as an information source on statistics about the international oil market and other energy sectors. Only OECD member states can become members of the IEA, and hence India is just an associate member of the International Energy Agency. Amongst the given statements, the second statement is incorrect. So option C is the right answer. The second statement is incorrect because the International Energy Agency was set up in 1974 after the 1973 oil crisis. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 15, the International Energy Agency has forecasted a huge drop in demand for crude oil in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The International Energy Agency has said that the recent production cut deal that was signed by the OPEC Plus countries won't be sufficient to offset the massive fall in demand, and this would lead to further decline in global oil prices. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2017 prelims paper. Which of the following is not included in the assets of a commercial bank in India? The correct answer is option B, deposits, because deposits are a liability to the bank. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, given that the COVID-19 pandemic will not end anytime soon, what measures can the government take to restore normalcy as soon as possible? The second question, critically evaluate the impact of US cutting its funding to the WHO. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.